All right, we are just going to continue with this in 1 Samuel chapter 15, and we are spending a lot of time in chapter 15. It's a lengthy chapter. There's a lot of information there and a lot of important things to talk about. Remember, back in verse 18, the Lord sent you on a mission. He's talking to King Saul. The Lord sent you on a mission. Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites. Fight against them until they're exterminated, until they are no more. And that was the mission he was sent on. Then the question comes in verse 19, why didn't you obey the voice of the Lord? You rushed on the spoil. You kept the king alive. You brought back the best of things. You did all of that sort of stuff, and you knew that wasn't what God commanded you to do. So that's a sort of a summary, a paraphrase of verse 19. In verse 20, King Saul argues, I did obey the voice of the Lord. And then he blames it on the people in verse 21. But the people took some of the spoil of the sheep, oxen, choicest of things, devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Well, that introduces our next section. The people did this. I didn't do it. The people did it. And they did it for a reason. They did it because they wanted to sacrifice to you at Gilgal. They wanted to bring all that stuff back and sacrifice it to you there. And then you get to verse 22. Samuel said, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. If you take verse 22 and lift it out of that chapter and just quote verse 22, it gets kind of confusing. Someone might read that and say, well, worship isn't that important. To obey is better than sacrifice. Maybe God wasn't even really concerned about all the things He commanded in the Old Testament law, about sacrificing animals on the altar. Maybe He really didn't care that much about that. You could do it, you could not do it, you could miss it, you could change it. Maybe God's not that concerned about how you worship, because it stresses that to obey is better than sacrifice. But it doesn't make sense that way, does it? If you misunderstand it that way, it doesn't make sense. And especially if you keep it in the setting of chapter 15, where Saul has said, we're coming to sacrifice these things at Gilgal. Won't that be wonderful? And what Samuel is doing is pointing out, you disobeyed God. So the point ends up being like this. What good is your sacrifice? What good is your worship if your life is lived in disobedience to God? What do we do to worship when our lives are disobedient? When we don't obey God and maybe show up, here's application, of course, show up on Sunday and we go through 5 acts of worship. What good is all of that? To obey is better than checking off the boxes. We shouldn't feel secure because, well, I showed up and we offered prayer and we took the Lord's Supper and we sang the hymns, and we shouldn't take comfort in that if we leave this place and go off and live contrary to God's Word the rest of the week. Just do what we please. And that's the emphasis that we find in this text. Samuel's pointing out that, and that becomes the issue. I remember the first time I read verse 22, I was really young, and I ran across that text, and I thought, well, does the sacrifice, does it matter? Does God care about that? Are we making mountains out of molehills when it comes to worship today? And we say, well, this is authorized, that's not authorized, you have to do it this way, but you can't do it that way. Is all that really important? Because I had a child's mind. Hadn't learned about context and about finding the meaning there. Remember what Samuel's point is. He had changed the command of God about the Amalekites. And then his excuse is, well, we're coming to offer these as sacrifice to God. Doesn't that make it all right? No, it doesn't. You need to obey God, not just go through the motions. Religion is meant to change us. Worship is meant to change us. And that wasn't happening with King Saul. You have other comments there? Yeah. Yeah, you find the same terminology here that you find in Joshua 7 with Achan when they were destroying Jericho, and he took of the accursed things, the things devoted to destruction, the things that belonged to God. And Achan took those, hid them under his tent floor, and that violated God's will. And that's the same terminology that we're finding in this chapter. Same words are being used. These things were devoted to destruction, devoted to God. And that was the sacrifice they were to give to Him. In Jericho, it was the first city in the campaign of conquest. It belonged to God. With the Amalekites, that belonged to God. God had had this in the works ever since they had left Egypt and traveling toward Canaan land, and the Amalekites withstood them and were vicious. They were vicious to the Israelites, and God determined to punish them from that day, and He held it off all this time, and now it's time. It's devoted to God. That was the sacrifice He demanded. You're exactly right. And so they were doing it their own way, in a sense changing the offering to God to accommodate themselves. Saul is really using religion here to promote himself. He wants to look good in front of the people. And so that does it. He's playing some politics there, and he's using religion that way. So, okay, that's a good comment, and we see how Saul's using all of that. The problem is his life is not bowed to God, and that makes all the difference. Now you get to verse 23, 1 Samuel 15, verse 23. For rebellion, he's describing Saul. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you've rejected the word of the Lord, He has also rejected you from being king. So you have a couple of different words, rebellion and insubordination. Maybe your translation has a couple of different words there. Or do you have a footnote or an explanation of the distinction between rebellion and insubordination? Arrogance, where is that in the place of? Insubordination, arrogance. Good. Stubbornness in place of? Okay, stubbornness. So we're focusing on maybe the insubordination part in my translation. Any other comments there? Distinction between the words? Here's the nearest that I could tell, and I might need to study this out some more. Rebellion, as near as I could tell, was about his relationship to God. Insubordination was his influence among men. It's like that. King Saul is like that. Toward God, rebellious and causing insubordination among men, his influence as king. So you have two directions you're looking at in what he has done. And he's being chastised for that. This is like divination. What's divination? Witchcraft. Okay? Remember when King Saul later in his life, now Samuel's going to part company from him, isn't he? Samuel's not going to counsel him anymore from God. Samuel was his access to God's Word. So that's not there anymore. And he's facing a battle. He's going to be facing a battle with the Philistines, and God won't talk to him. So what's he do? Where's he go? Bible memory, where's he go? Huh? Yeah, he went to the, some translations say the witch of Endor or medium of Endor, someone who was supposedly in contact with dead spirits and all. He's doing an end run around God. Divination is seeking information from another source other than God. I'm going to find out about future events. I'm going to find out about how things are going to be, but I'm not going to do it through God. I'm going to do it through another source. This is like, what he's just done is like divination. He's doing an end run around God. He's going around God to do what He wants to do. He's finding His authority from a different source. It's like iniquity, a very generic term for sin. It's like idolatry, putting something else in the place of God. Well, what do? He changed the Word of God. God told him what to do. He changed that. He manipulated it for his own benefit. This is like divination. This is like iniquity. This is like idolatry. Well, Samuel's describing Saul's character that rejects the will of God and does what he wants. Look at verse 23. Words, rebellion, divination, insubordination, iniquity, idolatry. That's King Saul's character. Why is he rejected as being king? That's his character. And God, through Samuel, is laying this out to Saul. You can't argue with it. You can try to argue with God, but God wins. God's right. And so he's laying this out, and he's doing it in a matter-of-fact way so that Saul has no choice but to admit it, and he finally does admit it. He just out and out admits it. And all the excuses are gone. You ever wonder what Judgment Day is going to be like? All the excuses, all of the faulty logic that men use about why they're doing this and why they're doing that and why this is right and not wrong. And Judgment Day is going to be such that it's just going to be laid out. The Bible tells us the books were opened, the facts. And here it is, in order. This is why. And there's no denying it. That's what Judgment Day is going to be like. So Saul's being convicted. And then I want you to look at verse 24. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I have indeed transgressed the command of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and listened to their voice. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that confession? He blamed it on somebody else. What word tips you off? Because. Because. You ever get an apology like that? I'm sorry I punched you in the nose because you said that. What? That's making it my fault. All right? So when somebody is apologizing and they tack a because on there, they're saying it was really out of my control. I really didn't have any choice. You ever have somebody say, well, I wouldn't have done that if you didn't push my buttons. It's your fault for pushing my buttons. I'm allowed to be out of control because you pushed my buttons. That's not right. So when somebody gives an apology and they tack a because on it, they're making it somebody else's fault. And that's what Saul's doing in verse 24. I have sinned. I've transgressed the command of the Lord and your words because it was those people. It was, and I succumbed to the fear of the people, the pressure they put on me. It was just such a threat from them, and I feared the people, and that's why I did it. And that's not going to be acceptable. So this is denying that he really is that way. He's just been told rebellion, divination, insubordination, iniquity, idolatry, that's who you are. That's what you did. And he's denying that he really is that way. It was because of the people. This is back to the Garden of Eden. Adam, what'd you do? Well, it was because of the woman. Woman, what'd you do? Well, it was because of the serpent. This is back to that kind of confession. Something else is the real culprit. All right, James chapter 1, just a brief detour. James chapter 1, verses 14 through 16. Listen to this terminology. This is about sin, how sin happens. Because each one, every individual, because each one is tempted, and he, the individual, is carried away and enticed by his own lust. This is how sin happens. If I sin, it's me. It's my choice. I did it. Nobody else's fault. It's on me. Own it. When you confess it fully. Don't make it somebody else's fault. So we go on to verses 25 and 26. Now therefore, please pardon my sin. Listen to what he's asking for. Please pardon my sin. Make it all go away. Make it disappear. Make it like it never happened. Please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. What's he asking Samuel to do? Let's make all this go away like it never happened. Nothing has changed. Everything's the way that it always was. And you come with me, and you will be like a calling card of approval for me, and we'll go and we'll worship the Lord. Notice that phrasing, worship the Lord. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. All right, now I want you to drop down to verses 30 through 31 and tell me what's changed. Then he said, I have sinned, but please honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel to go back with me that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back following Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. What happened between verses 25 and 26 and 30 and 31? You might have some options here. We might not have the definite answer, but we have some things to notice. What's different? He told him he wouldn't be king anymore. How did what Saul was asking change in verses 30 and 31? Yeah, it's, we're going to go back, we're going to worship the Lord. And am I putting too much on the word your? When he tells Samuel, and worship the Lord your God. God's rejected you, Saul. You're no longer going to be king. You sinned against the Lord. And then in the later verses, he talks about going back and worshiping the Lord your God. Is he suggesting that I know he's not my God because I put something else in his place? Is he at least recognizing more of his sin? Does he have the word because in verses 30 and 31? Is that there anymore? That's a strange terminology, isn't it? Wouldn't you think it would be odd if we saw each other out on the street and I said to you, looking forward to Sunday so that we can come worship the Lord your God? Shouldn't it be our God? So he's sort of using that kind of terminology as if there's something off there. Is he recognizing that Samuel is God's spokesman? But it's like there's a disconnect between Saul and God. Like there's something there. He tries to include himself in it in verses 25 and 26, but then he backs back off of that, and it's the Lord your God. It's just odd terminology, at least to me, that he would word it that way. Yeah, he wants Samuel to show some kind of approval of him in front of the people, but he's no longer asking, pardon my sin, make it go away. It's not, in the later verses, it's like he's recognizing things are not going to go back to the way that they were. There is no because, and he's recognizing a disconnect between himself and God. So there's a lot of things that are happening there. The request in verses 30 and 31 seems a little different than it did in verses 25 and 26. It's either that or Samuel just had such a personal relationship he caved in. And I don't see Samuel as caving in. That he separated from Saul, that he went his own direction, that he no longer had contact with Saul. All of that says a lot about Samuel's determination not to cave in. So I don't really see that as the option here. It has to be something else. Yes. Yeah, Sherry points out that when you get to David, you see David and a very consistent relationship with God, prayer, the great psalmist, and you see a different relationship between David and God than you do between Saul, who seems a step back from God and is only connected to him as he's connected to Samuel, but not as committed as David is at all. There is a distinction there. Good notice. All right, let's keep going if I can find my place again. So there is something different between verses 25 and 26 and then 30 and 31. And we move on to maybe verse 29. Hope I didn't jump too far ahead. Did I skip 27? Okay. Let me pass over it for now. I'll come back to that in a minute. Thank you. Verse 29. I want to look at that. Also, the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind. So the glory of Israel is talking about who? God. So the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. Does God ever change his mind in the Bible? Yeah. Once? Okay, once that you can remember. Okay. So what are you thinking of? Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay. So Brian brings up the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as the angels are departing from Abraham and they're heading toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Lord tells Abraham, I'm going to destroy this place, And Abraham begins to plead on behalf of those cities. He has a nephew there and his nephew's family, and he begins to plead, will you spare them if there's this many righteous? And he narrows it from like 50 all the way down to like 10. And so there is a pleading there, and God is at least willing to relent to that degree. So there's a changing, and Abraham would be, we would liken it to prayer. That God listens to our prayers and reacts to them. So God does change His mind in the Bible. I want you to consider this in Exodus 32, verse 14. This is when God was going to destroy the nation of Israel because of their sin at Mount Sinai, golden calf, and all that sort of stuff. So the Lord changed His mind about the harm He was going to do. Because Moses pleaded with Him, the Lord changed His mind. Jonah 4, verse 2. He prayed to the Lord and said, please, Lord, was it not this what I said while I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abundant in loving kindness, one who relents concerning calamity, willing to change your mind about that. He was fearful if he went and preached to Nineveh, that pagan city. He wanted them destroyed, but he was afraid if he preached to them and they repented, God may relent. He might change his mind about that. That's exactly what he said I was afraid of. Amos 7, verse 3, the Lord changed His mind about this. It shall not be, said the Lord. Then in Amos 7 and verse 6, there's this great locust swarm on the land, destroying the vegetation. And in verse 6, the Lord changed His mind about this. This too shall not be, said the Lord God. You have an illustration of God changing His mind. In Ezekiel chapter 18, it's the soul that sins that's going to die. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself. The wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. Verse 29, or verse 21, but if the wicked man turns from his sins, the wicked man's going to die. But if the wicked man turns from his sins, then he's going to live. And the same's true in verse 24 with the righteous man. But when a righteous man turns away from his righteousness, then he's going to die. What we're learning is this, that when man changes his mind about following God, God changes His mind about man. He does change His mind. So what we're reading about the Lord not changing His mind in 1 Samuel 15:29 is about something else. It's not about that kind of scenario. It's about God not changing His mind in a certain category. So we need to define that more. Brian? Okay. All right, interesting. Also in Ezekiel 18, when the righteous man sins, the blessing he was going to receive was removed. It wouldn't be to his benefit in that case. But I get your point with Saul. God's not going to change his mind. About what? What was just being talked about? About taking the kingdom away from Saul. About Saul no longer being king. I'm not going to change my mind about that. I'm not going to change my standard. And maybe if we put it there, if we let it land there, God has a standard. And He's not going to change that standard. He's not going to bend His rule about righteousness and wickedness and what He will embrace and what He will purge away from Himself. He's not going to change His standard. We're not going to be able to make it to heaven because we offer God a new set of rules. And God says, oh, okay, in your case I'll make that exception. He's not going to change His standard. He's not going to change His ultimate will. And that's what all of this is leading up to. And so if King Saul is pleading that, pardon my sin, make all this go away, make it not so, let me stay on the throne, come back with me, show your approval, I'm still king. No. God's not going to change His mind. He's not going to change His standard about things. We're finding out that our relationship with God is conditional. And we must never forget that. Other comments, ideas? All right. Then I do need to get back. I want to take a step back now to verses 27 and 28. As Samuel turned to go, Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it tore. So Samuel said to him, the Lord's torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Who's his neighbor? David. So he goes to turn away. He's leaving, and Saul wants to prevent him from going, grabs a hold of his robe, and Samuel's determined to go, and it tears. A piece tears off. And Samuel turns it into an object lesson. So the Lord has torn from you the kingdom this day, just like that. And that's an interesting use of that event. Saul, how big is Saul? He's a big guy. Physically, he would be intimidating. And he tries to prevent Samuel. What about the stature of Samuel? What do you know about him at this point? He's an old man. He's elderly. And he speaks this, the kingdom is not yours. God's rejecting you as king. He goes to turn away, and this big, head and shoulders above everybody else, great big guy grabs a hold of his robe and tears it. And the elderly man turns back and says, as an object lesson, so the Lord has torn the kingdom from you today. What more is there to say? That's it. So that is a great lesson that we're learning in these chapters. We move on now. Let's look at about verses 32 through 35, the end of this chapter. Then Samuel said, bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him cheerfully. And Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. What's Agag's attitude here? How's he feeling? He doesn't feel like he's ever going to be executed. He's a prisoner of war being treated well. He's a trophy in the court. Cautious, that Agag came cautiously instead of cheerfully? Really? Okay, let me circle that. I want to look at that. NIV. What translation says delicately? Huh? King James? I'm writing these down. I didn't notice all that. And cautiously. That's New King James? Okay. For now, we'll say my translation's right. And when he comes up, and does everybody's translation have this idea of surely the bitterness of death is past? So either he's whistling in the dark cheerfully, or he's coming up saying, surely the bitterness of death is past? I sure hope so. But he's feeling as though he's escaped the sword. He's feeling like he's home free, maybe, and that everything's going to be all right, and all that anger and resentment is passed by the wayside, and he's just a prisoner of war, maybe going to be treated all right, and have food to eat and shelter over his head, and he's going to escape that. And so he's thinking surely that's the case. But Samuel said, as your sword, listen to this, Amalekites. What kind of people were they? As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah. By the way, that charge against the Amalekites goes all the way back to what they did to Israel coming out of Egypt. It goes all the way back there. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house at Gibeah of Saul. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, for Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So we're learning some things. And one of the things we're learning with Agag, still alive, should have already been executed, but he was brought back as a captive, thinking that maybe he's escaped his death. The passing of time causes some people to feel like they're all right. The passing of time causes some people to feel like they've escaped the discipline and judgment of God. But that was not the case. There is, when Samuel goes to Ramah and King Saul goes to Gibeah, there's only about 2 miles between those two locations, but it is a huge separation between Saul and Samuel. Only about 2 miles geographically, but a huge separation between the men. And it's all about God. It's all because God rejected Saul that there is this huge separation between the two men. It states that he didn't see Saul anymore until the day of his death. But I want you to remember this, that in chapter 19, verse 24, he did see Saul again. Saul came to him at Ramah, but he did not see Saul again in the capacity of a counselor on behalf of God. He did not see him in that capacity anymore until the day of his death. And remember, that had to do with the medium of Endor. So we have a lot to talk about when we get up to that point. So there's a separation now. We move on to chapter 16, and this is where you have a shift in the book of 1 Samuel. Now we're going to see the focus on the relationship not between Samuel and Saul. That's come to an end. Now the relationship begins to form between Samuel and David. And he's going to be sent in chapter 16 to go anoint David as the next king. And so we will begin developing that as we finish up your handout. And we'll do that next week when we gather for Bible class and begin reading in chapter 16. And God tells Samuel, you've grieved over Saul long enough. We have to move forward. I have something for you to do. I want you to go to Bethlehem, and I want you to anoint the next king. And he doesn't tell him who it is or how it's all going to unfold. There's a map on the back of your handout, and it's really small print, but if you will look at Ramah on that handout, on that map, if you can find Ramah in small print there, and then you'll find Gibeah just down below that 2 miles, That's where King Saul is. Samuel's at Ramah, just to the north 2 miles. Bethlehem is south about 8 miles. So he has to pass by King Saul to get to the anointing of David. That presents a problem in our next chapter. And he actually is asking God, what am I going to say if Saul or his outlooks or people from him are asking me, where are you going and what are you doing? And God tells him, tell them you're going to make a sacrifice. Take a heifer with you. Tell them you're going to make a sacrifice. My question for you to study out for next week, is that dishonest? Is God telling Samuel to speak a half-truth, not the whole truth, like Abraham did with Sarah? In Egypt and Gerar, she's my sister, but he didn't say she's my wife. Is God being dishonest and telling Samuel to be deceptive in the same way? So I want you to think about that for next week. We'll come back to class and we'll begin unfolding that chapter. We are dismissed. Thank you.